A high-rise office tower does not care whose father you are. It only cares who signed in at the front desk. And on the morning this story begins, nobody had cleared a name for the man carrying a small pink lunchbox through the lobby of Callaway Holdings. What happened in the next 20 minutes would end with security hauling him out by the arms and a chairman weeping into his shoulder in front of the entire board. If you enjoy stories where a quiet man is underestimated right up until the moment the truth comes out, press subscribe now so you do not miss how this one ends. Daniel Reyes had exactly 11 minutes before his shift started at the marina, and he had already used 4 of them arguing with a parking attendant who did not believe a man in a flannel jacket had any business parking near the Callaway Holdings Tower. He did not have time to argue. He had a 9-year-old daughter named Etta who had left her lunchbox on the kitchen counter that morning, and he had a boss at the boatyard who docked pay for lateness, and he had, tucked somewhere under all of it, a name he had not used in 6 years. He did not think about that name as he pushed through the revolving doors. He thought about Etta's face when she realized at school that her lunch was not in her backpack, and about the peanut allergy list the school nurse kept, and about how his daughter never once complained when these mornings went wrong, which somehow made it worse. He held the lunchbox against his ribs like it was something fragile, which in a way it was. The lobby of Callaway Holdings smelled like citrus cleaner and cold marble, a smell that did not belong to him anymore if it ever had. He used to know buildings like this one. He used to walk into rooms like the one at the top of this tower and have people stand up when he entered. That was a long time ago, and he had buried it. The way a man buries a coat he does not plan to wear again. Folded at the bottom of a drawer, forgotten on purpose. The woman at the front desk looked at his boots, the salt stains on the leather, the grease under his nails that no amount of scrubbing ever fully lifted, and she looked at the lunchbox, and she asked him, not unkindly, if he was lost. "I'm dropping this off for my daughter," he said, "Etta Reyes. She's in the education outreach program on the 14th floor, the one the company runs with the elementary schools. Her lunch got left behind, and she's got a peanut allergy, and the school called me an hour ago." The receptionist's face changed at that, softened at the mention of the allergy, and she picked up her phone to call up to the program office. But before the call connected, a voice from behind Daniel cut through the lobby, brisk and irritated. The voice of a man who had never once in his life waited for anything. "We don't allow outside personnel past this floor without a badge," the man said. "Corporate policy. No exceptions today. Of all days." Daniel turned and took in the man in the charcoal suit. The kind of suit that cost more than Daniel made in a month at the marina. The kind of tie knotted just slightly too tight. Like the man wearing it needed everyone to see how expensive his own posture was. This was Julian Voss, though Daniel did not know the name yet, only that he had the look of a man who had spent his whole life being the exception to rules other people had to follow. "I'm not asking for a tour," Daniel said, keeping his voice level. "I'm asking for 2 minutes to hand a lunchbox to a program coordinator." "Today is not the day for that," Julian said, and something in the way he said it, some clipped, private urgency made Daniel look at him a second longer than he needed to. "We have a board meeting in 20 minutes that decides the future of this company. I am not having strangers wandering the halls." Daniel almost let it go right there. He almost turned around, called the school, arranged for someone else to run the lunchbox up, and walked back out into a life where none of this mattered. But then the elevator across the lobby opened, and a security guard stepped out, already reaching for Daniel's arm. And something about being grabbed before he had done anything at all made the old, buried part of him lift its head very slightly and take notice. "Sir, I need you to come with me," the guard said. "I haven't done anything," Daniel said. "I'm dropping off a lunchbox for a 9-year-old with a peanut allergy. That's the whole story." "Corporate policy," Julian repeated, already walking away, already checking his watch, a man who considered the matter closed the second he stopped looking at it. The guard's grip tightened on Daniel's arm, and Daniel did not fight it, because fighting it would only make things worse for Etta, somewhere upstairs, hungry and worried, and not understanding why her father was late. He let himself be walked toward the doors, boots scuffing on marble that had never once been scuffed by boots like his, and it was in that exact moment, with the glass doors swinging open onto the street, that a new elevator chimed behind them, and a woman's voice rang out across the lobby like a struck bell. "Stop! said Margaret Calloway. "Stop right there." Margaret was 61 years old and had run Calloway Holdings for 11 of those years, since her father's stroke had put the company in her hands 2 decades earlier than anyone expected, including her. She had raised her granddaughter's education program from a marketing footnote into the company's proudest initiative. The one thing in this building that still felt like it meant something beyond quarterly numbers. And she had walked out of the elevator specifically because a message had reached her that a parent had been detained in the lobby over an allergy medication. She looked at the guard's hand on Daniel's arm, and she looked at the lunchbox pressed to his chest, and something in her stomach went very still and very cold, the way it does when a person recognizes a shape before they recognize a face. "Let him go," she said. Now the guard released Daniel immediately because nobody in that building disobeyed Margaret Calloway's voice when it had that particular edge in it. Daniel straightened his jacket, rolled his shoulder where the grip had been too tight, and looked up at the elderly woman crossing the lobby toward him with a speed that seemed to cost her something in her knees, but that she was pushing through anyway. And it was in the moment Margaret got close enough to see his face. Clearly, really see it. Not the boots or the jacket or the grease under his nails, but the actual bones of his face, the set of his jaw, the particular color of his eyes that he had inherited from a woman dead 19 years now. That her hand went to her mouth, and she made a sound Daniel had not heard from her in 6 years. Not since the last time he had stood in front of her and told her he was leaving everything behind. "Daniel," she said, and his name and her voice cracked down the middle. "Daniel, is that you? If this opening pulled you in, drop the word 'stay' in the comments before we go on." Daniel Reyes had not been born. Daniel Reyes. He had been born Daniel Calloway, the only son of Margaret Calloway and her late husband, raised from birth to inherit a company that manufactured precision marine engines and had, over 3 generations, grown into a diversified holdings group with its fingers in shipping, logistics, and industrial manufacturing across 2 continents. He had gone to the right schools, learned the right handshakes, sat in boardrooms since he was old enough to be quiet in one, and by the time he turned 30, he had been the presumptive heir to all of it, a role he had never once asked for and never once refused, because refusing had never seemed like an option that existed. Then he had married a woman named Claire, marine biologist who thought corporate dinners were tedious and said so loudly, which Margaret had loved about her even when it embarrassed her, and they had a daughter, Etta, and for 3 years Daniel had lived a life split between boardrooms and bath time, between shareholder calls and story time. Managing both because Claire made the managing feel possible. Then Claire had died. A drunk driver on a coastal road at 11 at night, coming home from a lab that had kept her late, and Daniel had been left holding a 2-year-old daughter and a company that expected him to grieve quietly and be back at his desk within the week. His cousin, at the time a rising executive named Julian Voss, who had married into the family through Daniel's late aunt's side, had told him, not unkindly exactly, but not kindly either, that the company could not run itself while Daniel worked through his feelings, and that Etta would adjust. Children were resilient, and Daniel needed to remember what he owed the family name. Daniel had looked at his cousin and then at his daughter asleep in her crib, and he had understood with total clarity that he was being asked to choose, and that the company had already decided which choice it expected. So he made the other one. He changed his last name to his mother's maiden name, packed 2 suitcases, and moved 4 hours away to a coastal town where nobody knew what a Calloway was. And he took work as a boat mechanic because his hands had always been good with engines, whether they belonged to yachts or fishing boats. And because nobody at a marina asks you to be somewhere at 7 in the morning for a shareholder call while your daughter has a fever, he had not spoken to his mother in 6 years. Not out of hatred, out of a kind of grief that had calcified into distance, because every conversation with her felt like it circled back to the company, to duty, to what he was throwing away, and he did not have the strength to keep saying no to a woman he loved while also protecting the one person who needed him more than the company ever had. And now here she was, standing in front of him in a lobby, her hand shaking as she reached up to touch his jaw, like she was checking he was actually solid and not some grief-built illusion. And Daniel realized, distantly, that Julian Voss had gone very still by the elevator bank, the color draining out of his face the way water drains from a tub. Fast and complete. "You're supposed to be gone," Julian said before he could stop himself, and the sentence hung in the lobby like something spilled that could not be unspilled. Margaret turned on him with a speed that did not match her age at all. "What did you say?" "I mean," Julian said, recalibrating too late, "I mean, it's a surprise, obviously. After all this time, nobody expected." "You told the guards to remove him," Margaret said, "and it was not a question. You knew who he was, and you had him dragged out of my building." "I didn't know," Julian said. "I saw a man in work clothes causing a disturbance an hour before the most important board vote of the company's history, and I made a judgment call. That's my job." Daniel watched his cousin talk and felt something old and tired settle in his chest. Not quite anger, more like recognition, the way you recognize a smell you have not encountered in years and instantly know exactly what it is and where it comes from. Julian had always been like this, smooth, right up until the moment the smoothness stopped working, and then suddenly full of very reasonable explanations. "He's not causing a disturbance," Margaret said. "He is returning his daughter's lunchbox." His daughter, Julian, who has been in this building every week for the outreach program you personally approved the budget for, whose paperwork you personally signed off on, using the name Eta Reyes, which you never once thought to cross-reference, because you never once thought a mechanic's daughter was worth looking at closely. Julian said nothing to that, which told Daniel everything he needed to know about how close to the truth his mother had landed. "I need to get this lunchbox to my daughter," Daniel said quietly, "because underneath everything else, underneath 6 years in a company and a cousin's badly hidden panic, that was still the actual task in front of him, the one thing that mattered more than any of it. She's got a peanut allergy and a hungry stomach, and she's probably scared right now." Margaret's eyes filled, and she nodded fast, the way people nod when they are trying not to cry in front of subordinates. "Of course." "Of course, come with me. I'll take you up myself." They rode the elevator together in a silence that had 6 years of weight pressed into it, Margaret sneaking glances at her son like she was afraid he would vanish if she looked away too long, and Daniel staring at the numbers ticking upward, thinking about Etta's face, thinking about the fact that in about 90 seconds he was going to see her. And thinking, underneath all of it, in a small, cold corner of his mind, he had not visited in a long time, that Julian Voss had looked at him in that lobby the way a man looks at a witness he thought was already buried. Etta Reyes was 9 years old and had her mother's stubborn chin and her father's watchful eyes, and she had spent the last 40 minutes of the school day being very brave about being very hungry, because she did not want the teacher to make a big fuss, and she especially did not want the other kids in the outreach program to notice, since being the new kid whose dad fixed boats already made her different enough without adding a public hunger crisis to the list. She was sitting at a small round table in the 14th floor education office, coloring a worksheet about savings accounts that she did not really understand, when the door opened and her father walked in, holding her lunchbox like it was the most important object in the entire building, and behind him was an old woman Etta had never seen before, looking at her with an expression Etta could not quite name. Something between joy and grief that made her feel, the instinctive way children sometimes understand things before adults explain them, that this old woman already knew her somehow. "Dad," Etta said, standing up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "You came." "Course I came," Daniel said, crossing the room and crouching down to her height, the way he always did, so their eyes were level, so she never had to look up at him, like he was some distant authority instead of just her dad. "You left this on the counter. Figured you'd want it before your stomach started complaining." Etta took the lunchbox and hugged it to her chest, and then, because she was 9 and noticed everything, she looked past her father at the old woman standing in the doorway with tears on her face, and asked, with the blunt honesty only children manage without cruelty, "Why is she crying? Do you know her?" Daniel opened his mouth and found for the first time in 6 years that he did not have a rehearsed answer for this question, because he had never expected to need one. "This is your grandmother," he said finally. "My mom. It's a long story, sweetheart. I promise I'll tell you all of it. But she's your grandmother, and I think she's just really happy to meet you." Margaret knelt down slowly, her knees protesting, until she was at Etta's level too. And she looked at this small girl with Claire's chin and Daniel's eyes, and felt 6 years of absence collapse into a single, unbearable, wonderful moment. "Hello, Etta," she said. "I have wanted to meet you for a very long time. Are you rich?" Etta asked, because she had noticed the marble floors and the very expensive-looking cardigan Margaret was wearing. And children ask the questions adults are too polite to ask. "I run a company," Margaret said carefully. "Your father used to work here, with me, a long time ago, before you were born. He fixes boats now," Etta said, a little proudly, little defensively, as if bracing for the old woman to think less of her father for it. "I know," Margaret said, and something in her voice made it clear she did not think less of him at all. That, in fact, something about it had just rearranged everything she thought she understood about her son. "I think that's a very good thing to be able to do." Down the hall, unseen by any of them, Julian Voss stood with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent, telling someone on the other end of the line that there had been a complication, that the timeline needed to move up, that they could not afford to wait for the scheduled board vote anymore. Because if Daniel Calloway was back in that building, everything Julian had spent the last 18 months building toward was about to come apart in his hands, like wet paper. The emergency session Margaret called for that afternoon was not the meeting the board had been expecting. They had gathered that morning under the assumption they would be voting on a restructuring proposal that Julian Voss had championed for months, one that would consolidate operational control under a newly created chief operating structure, conveniently positioning Julian himself at its head, with Margaret retained as a largely ceremonial chairman while the actual decisions moved elsewhere. It was, on paper, dressed up in language about modernization and efficiency. It was, underneath the paper, a quiet coup that had been assembled one small manipulated data point at a time. Margaret had sensed something wrong with the numbers for months. Contracts that seemed to underperform right after Julian took them over. Vendor relationships that soured under circumstances that never quite made sense. A logistics partnership in the Gulf that had hemorrhaged money in a way. The reports blamed on market conditions, though the market conditions in question did not seem to be hurting any of Calloway's competitors. She had suspected Julian was behind some of it. She had never been able to prove enough to move against him, because Julian was careful, and because the board, dazzled by his confidence and his talk of modernization, had been inclined to trust him over an aging chairman they quietly worried was slowing down. But what Margaret had not expected, walking into that afternoon session with her estranged son at her side, was that the missing piece of proof had been fixing boat engines 4 hours down the coast for 6 years. Daniel had wanted to say no when she asked him to come into the meeting. He had Etta to think about a shift at the marina. He was already going to have to explain away a life he had built specifically to be far from rooms exactly like this one. But Etta was safely occupied with a tablet and a stack of coloring worksheets in Margaret's own office down the hall, watched over by Margaret's long-serving assistant, a woman named Ruth Alvarez who had worked for the Calloway family for over 30 years and who had, the moment she recognized Daniel's face in the doorway, gone pale and then protectively glad, the way people are glad to see a ghost turn out to have been alive all along. Ruth was the one who found it, in the end. While Daniel sat with Margaret going over what the board would be asked to vote on, Ruth had gone quietly into the archived vendor files from the Gulf Logistics contract, the ones nobody else had bothered pulling because Julian had assured everyone the losses were simply bad luck. She had worked for this family long enough to know that bad luck rarely showed up in such a consistent, convenient pattern, and she had spent 3 sleepless nights over the past 2 weeks cross-referencing shipping manifests against invoice dates because something about the whole arrangement had never sat right in her stomach. And Ruth Alvarez had learned a long time ago to trust her stomach over a smooth voice in an expensive suit. What she found and brought to Margaret an hour before the board meeting with hands that would not quite stop shaking was a set of shell vendor accounts, 3 of them, registered under addresses that traced back through a chain of paperwork designed to be tedious enough that nobody would follow it all the way, to a holding company controlled by Julian Voss himself. He had been quietly steering underperforming contracts to companies he secretly owned, skimming margin off the top while the losses on paper justified his argument that Callaway's traditional operations were inefficient and needed his new consolidated structure to survive. It was elegant in its way. It was also, Margaret realized with a cold fury she had not felt in years, theft, dressed up as vision. "I can read the shipping data," Daniel said quietly. When Ruth spread the papers across the desk, her hands still trembling. "I mean, actually read it, not the finance version. The mechanical version, the routing logic, the fuel consumption models, that was my specialty before I left. I built half the routing algorithms this company still uses." Margaret looked at her son properly, then in a way she had not allowed herself to in years, and saw not the boy who had walked away, but the man who had spent a decade before that mastering exactly the kind of technical detail that could unravel Julian's careful story in front of a room full of people who would never think to question it themselves. "You still remember all that?" "Mom," Daniel said, and the word came out rougher than he meant it to. 6 years of not saying it catching in his throat. "I didn't leave because I forgot who I was. I left because I couldn't be who I was and be Etta's father at the same time. Not the way things were set up. That doesn't mean the knowledge went anywhere." Ruth, watching the two of them, allowed herself the first easy breath she'd had in weeks. "The board convenes in 40 minutes, she said. "If we're doing this, we do it properly. With the evidence laid out, so even Julian's own allies can't pretend not to see it." Daniel looked at the papers on the desk, the manifests and invoices, and the quiet architecture of his cousin's theft, and felt something shift into place inside him that he had not felt in a long time, not since he had stopped being Daniel Callaway and become simply Daniel, a man who fixed engines and picked his daughter up from school. It was not the pull of the company. It was not ambition or a hunger to reclaim what he had walked away from. It was simpler than that and cleaner. It was the recognition that he had a specific rare set of skills, and that right now, those skills were the only thing standing between his mother and a man who intended to take everything from her. "Let's do it properly then," he said. The boardroom at 4 o'clock was full in a way. It rarely was, every seat occupied. The air thick with the particular tension of people who sense something large is about to happen and are trying to look like they do not. Julian Voss sat at the head of the table where he had been positioning himself for months, flanked by 2 board members he had spent a year cultivating with expensive dinners and carefully timed favors, and when Margaret walked in with Daniel at her side, Julian's jaw tightened just slightly, a small tell in an otherwise composed face. "I wasn't aware we were bringing outside guests to a board vote," Julian said, aiming for lightness and missing it by a wide margin. "He's not a guest," Margaret said, taking her seat at the head of the table with the unhurried authority of a woman who had earned that chair one difficult decision at a time for 11 years. "This is my son, Daniel Callaway. Some of you may remember him. Most of you will not, since he left before many of you joined this board. He is here because I asked him to review the technical data behind the Gulf Logistics contract, the one you have been citing for months as evidence that our traditional operations model is failing." A murmur went through the room, the specific murmur of people recalculating their assumptions in real time. Julian's smile stayed fixed in place, but something behind his eyes had gone very sharp and very still. "With respect," Julian said, "a boat mechanic reviewing shipping algorithms seems like an unusual choice of consultant. He designed the routing this company still uses," Margaret said, "before you joined this family, before you had any authority to consolidate anything. I'd suggest some respect of your own." Daniel stood, and he did not raise his voice, because he had learned a long time ago that a raised voice was usually a sign a man did not trust his own facts. He simply laid the printouts Ruth had assembled across the center of the table, one by one, in the order that told the clearest story. "The Gulf contract has shown consistent losses for 14 months, he said. "Julian has presented that as evidence of an outdated operational model. But the routing data tells a different story. 3 vendor accounts were inserted into the supply chain 18 months ago, right around when Julian took over direct oversight of that region. Those 3 accounts consistently receive contract awards at above market rates, and the shipping manifests show the actual goods moving through cheaper established channels. The difference between what Callaway pays and what the job actually costs goes somewhere. I traced the ownership structure behind those 3 vendor accounts this afternoon. All 3 trace back to a holding entity registered under Julian's name. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it that presses against your ears. "That's an absurd allegation," Julian said, and his voice had climbed half an octave, which told everyone at the table more than his words did. "Fabricated by a man who abandoned this company and clearly harbors some resentment about it." "I don't harbor resentment," Daniel said, and he meant it, said it simply, without heat. "I left because my daughter needed a father more than this company needed an heir, and I have never once regretted that choice. But I still know how to read a shipping manifest, and I still know how to trace a routing algorithm. And what these documents show is not an old grudge, it's math." One of the board members Julian had cultivated, a cautious man named Preston, who had spent the last year nodding along to whatever Julian proposed, leaned forward and studied the papers with a frown that suggested he was, for the first time in a long while, actually reading the numbers instead of trusting the narrative attached to them. "These vendor registration dates," Preston said slowly, "they do line up with when you took over Gulf operations, Julian." "Coincidence," Julian said too quickly. "Coincidence 3 times in 3 separate accounts, all above market rate, all routed through you," Margaret said. "Julian, I built cases against smarter men than you for smaller mistakes than this. Sit down." Julian did not sit down. Instead, he made the mistake that men like him always eventually make, the mistake of believing that confidence alone could still carry him across a gap that facts had already made too wide to jump. "This is a family conspiracy," he said, standing now, his voice rising in a way that made 2 board members visibly lean back from the table. "The prodigal son shows up hours before a vote, and suddenly I'm the villain. He vanished for 6 years, changed his name, and you're all just going to take his word over mine." "I'm not asking anyone to take my word," Daniel said quietly. "I'm asking them to take the shipping manifests. The numbers don't have an opinion about who abandoned what." Margaret rose from her chair then, and the whole room seemed to straighten with her, the way a room does when the person at its center finally speaks with total, unshakable certainty. "I have spent 11 years running this company on the belief that competence and integrity should outweigh charm and connections," she said. "I made an error in judgment, trusting you with as much authority as I did, Julian, and I take responsibility for that error. But I will not compound it by ignoring evidence because it is inconvenient, or because it arrived in the hands of a man some of you assumed had nothing left to offer this family. My son walked away from a fortune to raise his daughter with his own 2 hands, and he has just saved this company from a theft dressed up as a merger. I would trust him with this boardroom over any man sitting at this table who spent the last year currying favor instead of doing his job." The vote to remove Julian Voss from the board and to refer the vendor findings to the company's legal counsel and, subsequently, to federal investigators passed with only Julian's own vote cast against it. He was escorted from the building that same afternoon by the very security team that had dragged Daniel out that morning. A small, sharp irony that nobody in the room said aloud, but everyone quietly noticed. His allies on the board, sensing which way the wind had shifted, distanced themselves from him with the speed of men who had never really been loyal to anything but proximity to power. What happened after was quieter, and it was the part that mattered more. Margaret stood at the head of the boardroom table once the room had emptied, looking at her son standing there in his marina jacket, among the leather chairs and the mahogany, and she said the things she had wanted to say for 6 years and had never had the chance to. "I was wrong," she said. 6 years ago, I let this company make a demand on you that no company should ever make on a grieving father. I told myself I was protecting a legacy. I was really just afraid of losing control of something, and I let that fear cost me my son and my granddaughter's childhood. I am sorry, Daniel. I am so sorry." Daniel felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for 6 years, a knot he had stopped noticing because he had carried it for so long. "I forgave you a while ago, Mom," he said. "I just didn't know how to come back and say it without it looking like I wanted something. I didn't want the company. I still don't." "I know," Margaret said. "That's exactly why I'm asking you to take it anyway, not the way it was before. Not the version that demands you disappear into a title and miss every school play and every fever in the night. I'm asking you to help me rebuild this into something that doesn't ask fathers to choose between their children and their duty. On your terms, Daniel, whatever those terms are." Daniel thought about Etta down the hall, coloring worksheets about savings accounts she didn't understand yet, and about the marina, and about the 6 years he'd spent with grease under his nails and his daughter's hand in his. And he understood that his mother was not asking him to become the man he used to be. She was asking him to bring that man's skills into the life he had actually built, the one with Etta at its center, and to do it without losing a single afternoon of picking his daughter up from school. "I'll consult," Daniel said, "on the technical side. Routing, logistics, engineering, oversight. I keep the marina job. I keep every school pickup, every parent-teacher conference, every single one. If this company ever asks me to choose between it and my daughter again, I walk, and I don't come back a second time." "Agreed," Margaret said without a single second of hesitation, and something in her voice told Daniel she meant it all the way down. They found Etta in Margaret's office an hour later, having colored an entire worksheet about compound interest into something that looked more like abstract art than finance. And when Daniel scooped her up, she asked, with the easy directness of a child who has decided an adult is trustworthy, whether they were going to see the grandmother lady again soon. "Every week, if you want," Margaret said, crouching down despite her knees, because some things were worth the ache. "But there's an ice cream place 2 blocks from here that I've been told is very good, if you're interested in a standing appointment." "I'm very interested," Etta said solemnly, and Daniel laughed for the first time all day. A real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere old and unguarded. It took another 3 weeks for Ruth Alvarez to finish untangling the last of Julian's shell accounts. Weeks in which the federal investigators built a case methodical enough to make sure he would not simply resurface somewhere else with a new title and the same old habits. Preston, the board member who had first leaned forward to actually read the numbers instead of the narrative, became, quietly, one of Margaret's steadiest allies, having learned something about the difference between confidence and competence that he did not forget again. The company issued a public statement acknowledging the fraud and outlining new financial oversight protocols that Daniel himself helped design over long evenings at his kitchen table. Etta, doing homework across from him, the two of them working in comfortable parallel. Margaret came to the marina the first time, on a Saturday, unannounced, wearing sensible shoes instead of heels, for what Daniel suspected was the first time in a decade, and she watched her son work on an outboard motor with the same quiet focus he had once brought to routing algorithms worth millions of dollars, and she understood, finally, that she had never lost her son to a fishing town and a mechanic's jacket. She had simply never bothered to look closely enough to see that the same brilliance had just found a smaller, gentler place to live. Etta showed her grandmother the shed where her father kept his tools, narrating each one with the seriousness of a small tour guide, and when she got to the drawer where Daniel kept a folded, faded photograph of Claire, she said, without any adult's hesitation, "That's my mom. She died before I could really remember her, but Dad says she would have liked you." Margaret had to look away for a moment, out toward the water, before she trusted her voice enough to answer. "I think I would have liked her very much too," she said, and meant it. On a quiet evening some weeks later, after the investigation had closed and the board had settled and the company had begun, slowly, to feel like a place built on something sturdier than fear, Margaret sat with Daniel on the curb outside the marina office, watching Etta chase the tide out along the wet sand. And she asked him the question she had been sitting on for weeks. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "The 6 years, the name change, all of it." Daniel watched his daughter for a long moment before answering. "No," he said. "I regret that it hurt you. I regret the years we lost. But I don't regret choosing her over the company. Not for 1 second. I'd make the same choice again tomorrow." "I know," Margaret said. "That's what finally made me understand what actually matters. It took me 61 years and losing my son to learn it. I'd like to think I've got time to do better with what's left." Daniel looked at his mother, then at the woman who had run a company for 11 years with an iron grip and had just spent the better part of a season learning to loosen it. And he felt something that had been missing for a long time settle quietly into place between them. Not quite forgiveness, because that had already happened, but something steadier. Trust, maybe? The kind that gets rebuilt slowly, one honest afternoon at a time, the way you rebuild anything that actually matters. Etta ran back up the beach, just as the sun started dipping low and orange over the water, breathless, holding up a shell she had found, and she climbed into the space between her father and her grandmother on the curb like it was the most natural seat in the world, like she had always belonged exactly there. And in the end, that was the whole story, really. Not a company saved, though it was. Not a villain exposed, though he had been. Just a father who never stopped choosing his daughter, a mother who learned, late but not too late, what that choice had actually cost and what it had actually been worth, and a little girl who got her grandmother back the same ordinary Tuesday she got her lunchbox returned, never once suspecting that returning it would change everything. If stories like this one, about quiet men who turn out to be more than anyone expected, and about the families that find their way back to each other, are the kind that stay with you, hit subscribe, because there are more of them coming, and this will not be the last time an ordinary afternoon turns out to hold an entire family's second chance inside it.